Welcome to the Filmlings podcast,
an honest-to-goodness podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 153, Films of FAERIE 1, the podcast that laughed and cried like a child.
Yep, a podcast that syncs up remarkably well with the release of Puss in Boots: The Last Wish on Netflix. Not a sponsor.
Nope.
But terribly serendipitous.
Yeah, I posted in our Discord channel. Shameless plug there if you want to go join us. But that movie, we're not even going to talk about that movie, frankly. But the movie is kind of a perfect bridge from our last series about Westerns into this series about fairy tales, because it's Puss in Boots, it's in the Shrek universe. But frankly, everything else about it is just a straight Western with sparkles.
Which honestly makes sense, because if you think about the original Shrek, it was a twist on not just a fairy tale, but a chivalric tale. And we talked about how much chivalric tales basically influenced Westerns, and Westerns kind of became a more modernized version of that. So there you go. There's proof that there's depth in everything, even the Shrekiverse.
Yeah, and actually Shrek will be coming up later on in this series, so keep that in mind. And check out Puss in Boots if you get a chance. But yeah, so we're starting a new series on fairy tales, and this is something that we surprisingly haven't delved into all that much on the podcast so far. We've touched on it here and there. It's because we were
cursed not to.
We were cursed not to, but we're breaking the curse now. Mm-hmm. And we're going to talk all about it for the next several months. And really, I think it'll be a good kind of just deep dive into stories, into a lot of like really granular elements of what goes into stories and how stories are presented and told. And then specifically how that works its way out in film. So let's do a little bit of background, or maybe a little bit more than a little bit of background on fairy tales in general. So fairy tales are pretty much a subset of a more general type of storytelling known as folk tales, which is an oral tradition where people tell stories just kind of around the campfire, before you had a lot of people who were super literate, or, way before there was films and stuff like that. You just have people telling stories. Right. And fairy tales are a subset of that deal with things that are kind of magical or wonderful. So they pretty much, some of the most common aspects are things like magic or talking animals and stuff like that. And there's certain folklorists that don't even call them fairy tales, but they call them wonder tales, which kind of derive from the German Märchen or Wundermärchen. Forgive me, all my German people out there, of which there are probably a very small amount, but you're going to hear that word a few more times here in a second. So fairies are not necessarily a necessary element to fairy tales, but that wonderful or marvelous element is. And according to the folklorist Stith Thompson, who's important, we'll touch on him again in a second, a fairy tale is a tale of some length involving a succession of motifs or episodes. It moves in an unreal world without definite locality or definite creatures, and is filled with the marvelous. So that's kind of what we're talking about. It's a world that is filled. It's very similar to our world, but it's filled with magical things, and it's kind of ambiguous enough that it can be really fluid. And we're going to see that is true of these stories. They are able to really easily cross cultural boundaries and take on different forms with the same substance in pretty much any place in the world.
Jonathan, I just want to interject real quick and say that both your word use and everything you've described so far could be compared pretty solidly to the MCU. I just want to throw that out there.
I was wondering how long that was going to take, and you're just going to start us off with it. Okay.
It's right there. You said marvelous.
Yes. Oh, yeah. I wasn't even putting that one together. Yeah, I'm sure that's going to come up a lot, so I'm not going to indulge that point right now.
I guess in a way, we say this with everything, but I guess in a way, Marvel movies are the modern day fairy tales.
Yep. I was waiting for that too. But there is a distinction, and we'll talk about some of the really strict boundaries that I'm at least putting on the category of fairy tales for what we're going to talk about here in a minute.
Healthy boundaries are important.
So another distinction is that when we're talking about fairy tales, typically these days we're talking about what's known as Kunstmärchen.
Kunstmärchen.
Which is literary fairy tales, or I think that comes as art or artistic fairy tales from the German. So that's fairy tales that have been taken from the oral tradition and translated into typically the written word. And so then for the purposes of this podcast, we're going to be expanding that even further into what I will dub Kinomärchen. So some of the earliest Kunstmärchen, such as, I know, I'm saying this word a lot, but we're going to get through it. Such as the Italian Pentamerone from around 1635, as a series of really wild fairy tales, but that have a lot of resemblance to ones that we're familiar with. But those stories heavily reworked the oral tales in order to put them in the written form. And then when you get to the Grimm brothers, then they were the first ones to really kind of try to preserve both the stories and the style in which those stories would have been told in the oral tradition. And yet even that was never without controversy, because, you know, we talk a lot about the ways that you adapt stuff. We talk about how you adapt stuff from books into film and what you change and where it's good to change stuff and where you want to keep from the source material. And that's going to kind of come up here too. But that was even happening back when the Grimm brothers were putting down their collection of fairy tales. So they argued over which tales to include just based on where the tale came from, because they wanted their collection to be strictly German fairy tales. So if
this sounds like an argument that could happen over which comics are canonical on a Marvel chat room board.
Yeah, exactly. But also the first edition of their, here we go again, Kinder- und Hausmärchen, which is children's and household tales. That was the collection that they originally published of their fairy tales. Got backlash for not being very child friendly, both because it had a ton of scholarly material about where they got, basically they were nerds for fairy tales, and they just like would put in a bunch of information about where they got the tales from and what they were related to and stuff like that.
But their branding was off.
Yeah, their branding was off. But also,
like, no, not tales for children, tales about children.
That's probably pretty accurate, because a lot of the content in the stories was not very child friendly either. And if you go back and read them, they still don't seem very child friendly, but they have been revised. They were even revised by the Brothers Grimm, who put out several versions of their fairy tale collection over the next couple of decades.
They typically end fairly gruesomely, don't they?
They do end fairly gruesomely, but it's interesting that mostly they removed sexual references and just kind of left a lot of the violence in there. So I've been reading through a lot of them right now. Some of them are really dark.
Aren't they all supposed to be like folk tales that are warnings for children about like, hey, if you screw up, this really bad thing's going to happen to you, so don't screw up?
They can be. And we'll kind of talk about that, because there's some of them are that. Some of them are literally just bad jokes and almost puns sometimes. It's a weird collection of stories. Yeah, there's wild range of moralistic tales to tales that seem to have literally no point whatsoever.
They're just spooky ghost stories to tell around a campfire.
Spooky ghost stories, or just silly. There's some about, like, I don't know, just cats and eggs and stuff. And then they like, there's, I don't remember how it goes, but there's like a cat and eggs. An egg and a chicken, and they're all going in search of something. And they end up at this miller's house. And when he comes home, like, he just bumps into all of them and they all hurt him in some way. And it's literally slapstick. It's just ridiculous. It's kind of crazy. But as the study of folklore and fairy tales continued to grow, it became apparent that many of these stories had very similar themes and plots across cultural barriers. But tracing the history of these folk tales is nearly impossible once you get to the oral tradition. So it's really hard to say, like, this story is authentically German, because then you find a story from Arabia or something that is very, very similar, but with a lot of different cultural backdrop to it. Or even just between German fairy tales and French fairy tales and Italian fairy tales and all that kind of stuff.
Well, don't all those languages come from the Proto-Indo-European language tree?
Yeah.
Are there any theories out there about them dating so far back that they dated to before all those people split out?
I think it is. I think that's really because there's a lot of the that the European branch and the Indian fairy tales are very similar. So yeah, there's some of that, and I didn't dig all the way back that far, but there's definitely.
You didn't time travel to Proto-Indo-Europe?
I did not travel that far.
If they were all similar.
But there have been folklorists who have not necessarily gone back, but they take the fairy tales that we have now, and they have extensively organized them. So there are categorizations such as the ATU index, which is Arne Thompson Uther index. Those are three folklorists who each built upon this collection of categories to put fairy tales into. There's over 600 categories, where, you know, Beauty and the Beast is a category because it kind of embodies a whole set of tales about someone who's under an enchantment who needs, you know, a true love's kiss or whatever to come back from it.
Shouldn't Cinderella be a whole category in and of itself? I feel like there's a billion of those.
Yeah, and there's crossover too, because you can have some kind of Cinderella story, but you can also have fairy godmother stories, which can be separate from Cinderella, but they still have that, you know, crossover there.
Not to be confused with Cinderella Story, the Disney Channel original movie from about 2003.
Definitely not to be confused. And then there's also the Motif Index of Folk Literature by Stith Thompson, as I mentioned before, and he's also the Thompson of the Arne Thompson Uther Index. So he spent a lot of time with these folk stories. And I'm still not completely sure what the difference between the motifs and the ATU index categories are, but there's some differentiation there. Those two are often used in conjunction, so it kind of overflows. And I do want to point out at this point that, as I said, folktales come from all countries. There's a lot of overlap. For the purposes of the podcast, though, we're going to stick mostly to fairy tales that have European origins, just because those are typically the ones that are most well known to us as an American audience, and also the ones, that have generally been adapted the most into film. So it'll just give us a lot of touch points to pull from, but we'll venture out a little bit. So since Grimm, there have been other authors and folklorists who have collected and then started to write their own fairy tales after studying fairy tales. These are the fairy tale brats, at least the fairy tale school brats who have studied fairy tales and then started to write their own. Man. Yeah, so you have Charles Perrault from the late 1600s. He wrote Puss in Boots and a lot of other super well-known stories. Hans Christian Andersen from the mid 1800s, who wrote several that we're going to be talking about throughout the series. And then George MacDonald in the late 1800s, and also Andrew Lang, who was both a writer and compiler of fairy tales in the late 1800s. And he has this whole series of fairy tale books: the Blue Fairy Tale Book, the Lavender Fairy Tale Book, the Lilac Fairy Tale Book, where he just collects a ton of fairy tales and then writes a few of his own and sticks them in there, maybe just to make his own feel more important. I don't know. But anyway,
really collect the greatest hits of fairy tales and also drop a few of your originals in the mix.
Yeah, just hope they go down.
Mine are up there too, man.
So then by the time we get to the mid 1900s, we have authors like Tolkien and Lewis with The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and The Chronicles of Narnia. And these guys are also super well educated on fairy tales and mythology, and so they're working that into their stories. But now those stories are getting so big and grand that essentially they break off into their own category, which is now fantasy. Now, fantasy is one of the biggest story writing genres that we have, especially in YA novels and stuff like that. And so, but those are separate, because fairy tales are much more kind of boiled down and almost bite-sized versions of fantasy.
Yeah, fairy tales don't really have to make sense in the same way that fantasy does.
Yeah, they're sometimes they can get a little bit on the adventure, a little bit on the epic, but they're never full scale.
Yeah.
Or not necessarily. I mean,
the conceit of the story seems very different.
Right.
You approach it as a reader with a very different set of expectations. Right.
So, but Tolkien, like I said, super influenced by these stories, and he wrote a really influential essay. I think it was supposed to be a lecture that never ended up happening, so it turned into an essay about fairy tales called On Fairy Stories. And folklorists still kind of use this as an important guidelines for fairy tales. So that's kind of what we're using to guide our look at fairy tales here. And so he put some of these boundaries on what fairy tales are. And so not a beast fable. So think of Aesop. Those are stories that only involve animals. So fairy tales typically involve the conjoining of the human world with some kind of realm of fairy or the supernatural or something like that. And supernatural isn't even exactly the right word, but the mystical or something like that. And travelogues don't count either, because travelers' tales are always kind of fantastic, tall tales. So they kind of get discounted from the fairy tale, which has to have some kind of semblance of a rooting in reality. And to that end, the magic in the story, inside the story, has to be taken completely seriously. So it can't be a dream. You can't explain it away technologically or mechanically. And if the story is satirical, you can't laugh at the magic. The magic is an integral part of the story, and so it has to be treated as such by the characters and those within the story. So that's the general guidelines that I was trying to use when pulling films for this. And then also, he kind of outlines some of the primary virtues that people still get from reading fairy tales from children to adults. And I kind of want to take these categories and break them out in the following episodes. But as an overview, you have fantasy, which is kind of the idea of imagination. And Tolkien, as a philologist, gets way into this, because he's like, with language, fairy tales or fantasy doesn't even exist without adjectives. Because if you don't have a concept of grass being green, then something like purple grass would not be fantastical to you. So he goes way into the ways that language creates fantasy, and the ways that we imagine language kind of bring that about as we experience fantasy. And then he talks about recovery, which is a renewed appreciation for the actual world around us that fairy tales can give. Escape, which is a sense of kind of imagining a world without the trappings of our own world. And fairy tales have their own trappings and stuff, but they're kind of the fantasy gloss on the trappings of the fairy tale world almost make those trappings more desirable than the failings of our own world. And then consolation, which is the happily ever after, which, to be sure, is not present in every fairy tale, but at least when you go back to a lot of the sources, if you're only familiar with the film versions.
Is that equivalent to the catharsis, or is that more post-catharsis?
Yeah, it's post-catharsis, because it's really, he talks about how in drama, he says that like the highest form of drama is the tragedy. And in fairy tales, the highest form would be the eucatastrophe. So the catastrophe is basically kind of that catharsis. It's the where everything is turned upside down. That's the word catastrophe, is to turn upside down. So when everything changes, usually it's a bad thing. Like a catastrophic event is when everything goes wrong. But in fairy tales, there's the eucatastrophe, where something happens that sets everything right again. And that's kind of the consolation that you're left with at the end of a really good fairy tale. And there's a lot of bad that has to happen before that, but usually there's that, you feel better about it at the end.
I gotcha. So it's like it's almost like a longer version of a catharsis. Like the catharsis would mark the start of that, and then you see how everything's been righted afterwards.
Yeah.
The world changing back to the way it was intended to be, or something like that. Or to a better version than it was before.
Or even, sometimes it's even just kind of a revelation. Because even if something has happened in the story that's almost irreversible, a lot of times in fairy tales, whatever happens in the story is reversible. But sometimes it's just a matter of revealing information that justifies what has happened to the characters. So all that to say, there's a lot more to say about fairy tales and stuff. This is kind of a really quick run through, even though it's been a pretty long run through. But we'll pick up more of that along the way. Now, the last thing to get into before we start talking about our movies today is Pinocchio. So that's what we're talking about today. We're talking about one story that I think has a lot of elements of fairy tales really packed into it.
Pinocchio.
And it's also still on the mind because people are still making adaptations of it, and we're going to talk about those. But let's talk about the origin of that story, which is The Adventures of Pinocchio by Carlo Collodi. And it was published.
Are you wearing ladies' underpants? I am not.
It can verify that is non-canonical. The book was published in 1883 after it had been a serial in a magazine, which totally makes sense because of how episodic and kind of just what a roller coaster the actual story is.
It's incredibly episodic. That was one thing I didn't notice until we had revisited it, was how broken up the story is. It's not one solid tale. It's a series of tales.
And there are a ton of episodes that don't make it into any adaptations. If you get a chance, you should go back, just an audience, go back and read the book because it's a wild story. And just as background on Collodi, he had spent a lot of time translating French fairy tales into Italian and apparently did a really good job. And so people started hampering him like, hey, you should write your own children's stories. And so he did. And he wrote several others than this, but this is by far his most well-known. And really, children's literature wasn't that big of a thing at the time. And so after it was serialized and it went to be turned into a book, the editor said, hey, you know, the part at the end where Pinocchio gets hanged for being such a bad boy, what if the fairy comes and saves him and teaches him a lesson about himself? And so they added that eucatastrophe into the story because it had such a dark ending originally. But after it was published, it was immediately popular. It was popular as a serial, and then it was popular after it was published. Currently, it's the world's third most translated book, according to Wikipedia. And that list is completely riddled with fairy tale books that have been translated into just so many languages. And it has been adapted innumerable times. But today, we're going to talk about 3. So, Alex, would you like to talk us through which 3 versions of Pinocchio we'll be talking about?
Of course, or as the Italians say, certo. Yes, so first we're going to talk about the one most people probably know about, which is Pinocchio from 1940, the Disney version.
Although, if you're anything like me, you may have watched it like once as a kid, but this was one that I was not super familiar with. So it was really interesting to go back and revisit it.
I don't think it's super high on the tier list of a lot of super Disney fans. I'm not a Disney adult, and I don't know many Disney adults. I would have to ask one of them if where it ranks on the list in that.
Although
community.
A lot of animation people say that it's one of Disney's best, just from the animation standpoint.
The animation is great. It's great. I think we'll get into it, but I think the episodic nature of it made it hard to adapt into a movie format. But we'll talk about that across all 3 films.
Also, it's friggin' scary.
Yes, it's a pretty terrifying fairy tale for even for a Disneyfied version of the fairy tale. But anyway, this one was directed by Norman Ferguson. It was also directed by somebody who's credited as the initial T, last name He. So his name is T. He. I guess her name could be T. He as well, but probably a he, knowing 1940s Disney. And then Wilfred Jackson. Man, T. He. I would love to see that IMDb page. It was written, or I should say adapted, by Ted Sears and Otto Englander. And it starred Dickie Jones, Christian Rubb, and Mel Blanc. Ooh, Mel Blanc's in there. That makes a lot of sense. And then we're going to talk about Pinocchio from 2019, the European version, which is directed by Matteo Garrone, written by Matteo Garrone and Massimo Ceccarini, starring Federico Iolapi, Roberto Benigni, Rocco Papaleo, Massimo Ceccarini. Why'd you have to put so many of these? Maureen Vax and Alida Baldare Calabria.
They're all
and it
important
has
characters.
Cinematography by Nicolai Bruel and music by Dario Marianelli. And then we're going to talk about, finally, the Spaniards version. Or is Guillermo...
He's Mexican.
Does he have dual citizenship, or is he just Mexican? Because he does so much work in Spain, too. I don't know. But anyway, we're talking about Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio from 2022, which I did not realize was actually titled Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio, which...
Yeah, he was born in Guadalajara.
It has to be a marketing decision to put his name in there. I don't want to believe that he decided to put his name in there. Like, to be unofficially known as Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio is one thing, but to just put your name in the title like that is kind of weird. I don't know whose decision that was, but like I was saying,
a Guillermo del Toro joint.
Yeah, I have to believe it was his marketing department, not him, who decided that. But anyway, it was directed by more than just Guillermo del Toro. It's directed by him and Mark Gustafsson, written by Guillermo del Toro and Patrick McHale, and starring Gregory Mann, David Bradley, Ewan McGregor, Christoph Waltz, Ron Perlman, Tilda Swinton, and Kate Blanchett. Cinematography by Frank Passingham, and music by Alexandra Desplat. Is that French? Do you just quit halfway through the word like that? Yeah, we'll go with that.
We'll go with that. So 2 notes on that. Patrick McHale is the creator of Over the Garden Wall, which I just realized.
Oh, so really?
Interesting. Yeah.
Over the Garden Wall is great. That's great animation, man.
And second, do you know who Kate Blanchett plays in the film?
Who does she play in the film?
She plays the monkey.
What?
Yeah.
They got Kate Blanchett in to play a monkey?
So there's a whole thing. So Kate Blanchett was in Nightmare Alley. And apparently her and Guillermo del Toro were having such a fun time filming that. And Guillermo was starting to work on Pinocchio and stuff. And Kate Blanchett said, I will do anything for you. I will be in anything. I will be a pencil in your movie. And Guillermo was like, well, I literally only have one character not cast yet. And it's a monkey. She's like, I'll do it. I'm in. So she
I will say it's a very good performance for a monkey. Like, it's solid.
But I just love that Galadriel is spazzatura.
Spazzatura.
All right, so with all that introduction, let's talk about these movies because we still have lots to talk about with these guys. So, Jason, set us up for Walt Disney's Pinocchio from 1940.
Pinocchio from 1940. A poor cricket, Jiminy Cricket, wanders into the house of an old childless woodcarver named Geppetto on the night that he makes a wish on a wishing star that his marionette Pinocchio was a real boy. While Geppetto sleeps, a fairy arrives who gives life to the puppet and commissions Jiminy as his conscience. Although Pinocchio is still a puppet, the fairy explains that if he proves to be brave, truthful, and unselfish, then someday he can become a real boy. Geppetto is overjoyed at finding Pinocchio brought to life and promptly sends him to school the next day. But on the way, Pinocchio runs into a fox and a cat who separate him from Jiminy and convince him to join a traveling puppet show where he is captured by the puppet master, Stromboli. After being rescued by the fairy, he again runs into the fox and cat who convince him to travel to Pleasure Island, which turns out to be a new kind of trap. All the while, Jiminy is always a few steps behind. Meanwhile, when Pinocchio fails to return home from school, Geppetto sets out to look for him and becomes lost at sea, swallowed by a giant fish known as Monstro. Pinocchio must ultimately rescue his father and in the process learn what it takes to become a real boy.
All right, Jonathan, I think this is a good time to talk about the episodic nature of Pinocchio and the struggles of turning something that's
ironically, I think this is the least episodic of them, even though it is a very episodic
It struggles
film.
with it. And the thing is, like, when you're looking at an episodic tale like Pinocchio that was released in essentially chapters that are very distinct from each other, the initial thought, especially from a modern standpoint, is that would be perfect for a TV show because you could do something different in every episode. Trying to make a consistent narrative from something with like essentially a bajillion chapters that are a bajillion different acts with different beginnings, middles, and ends into a structured 3-act movie is hard. And you see that in each of these movies today. It's difficult to adapt. And like you were saying earlier, this is not one of the most fondly remembered Disney movies for its story. And I think that's a big part of the reason for it.
And yet, so yeah, I think there's two camps though. I think there's people who didn't watch it a lot because their parents just thought it was a really weird movie, which it is. And yet the story itself and the way that Disney is so good at really just pulling the most essential things and, you know, putting their Disney gloss on the whole thing. But
you got to make it as short as possible, but effective as possible, because animation, especially in the olden days, is expansive.
Yeah. So in that same vein, though, the story of Pinocchio is so condensed that it has so much archetypal content to it that you can analyze the crap out of this film from almost any direction, like sociologically or psychologically or whatever. It's just so simple, and there's so much interesting detail that Disney puts in there that it's just ripe for analyzation. And it's also really interesting to see which of the elements that Disney chooses to focus on. And also something that I'm going in two different directions here, but I think it's really interesting, first of all, just to say that Disney as a force, and this is something we're going to touch on later in the series very soon, but Disney has a way of taking a lot of these stories that, although very popular, may have become much more obscure until the Disney version came out. And now the Disney version of Pinocchio is practically all anyone knows about Pinocchio. And so
that's the way with a lot of Disney,
right?
A lot of Disney fairy tales. Yeah.
So what they've done is created a new Pinocchio that is now the public image of Pinocchio, which puts its emphasis in different places than the original story. So the way that the Blue Fairy comes in fairy godmother fashion is very different, as we'll see, to how the fairy with turquoise hair works in the story. But also like the emphasis on the lying and stuff. So when the Blue Fairy comes and says, you need to prove yourself to be, what does it say? Honest, brave, and unselfish. And those are the three things which I'm be interested to talk about if he actually does that when he turns into a real boy. But those are like the three things that the film focuses on. So honesty is a big thing, honesty and bravery, especially when he goes to save his father. And so those are the things that Disney has decided to extrapolate from the story and kind of make that the main focus. So then Pinocchio gets known for his growing nose, which is a teeny tiny aspect of the original story, but now it's the defining characteristic of Pinocchio.
Yeah, it's kind of like the thing most people know about Pinocchio.
Yeah. So yeah, and then the chapters that they do choose to focus on are going to be important. So we have the aspect, almost every version has Pinocchio goes to school, and on his way he gets sidetracked to the circus or the puppet
carnival
show.
Yeah, the carnival is in every single adaptation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then, so he gets captured, and there he learns his first lesson about lying. And then, so yeah, the fox and the cat in this one are just literally there to just send him on misadventure after misadventure. They're not even really after his money in this one. They're just there to send him in the wrong direction because it's
plot
fun.
elements. Yeah. Yeah. Disney's very good at, like you said, at stripping things down and just making a very functional, very efficient machine, which has some weird analogs with like American manufacturing of the 1940s and 1950s when it was becoming very efficient by stripping things down to make very simple, effective machines. I guess the Model T kind of predates it, but the Model T would be another good example. Something, much simpler, but very effective and easier to make than something more complex like the weird, crazy inner mechanics of a German car. Which is horribly ironic because a lot of fairy tales come from Germany. So Disney was kind of doing the same thing to European fairy tales that Ford and Chevy were doing to European styles of engineering in cars.
Yeah. And that's not even to touch on, which I guess we will a little bit, but not really historically, the, propaganda aspects of Disney specifically, but fairy tales on both the German and American sides.
Oh, very, 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 very much so. Yeah. They, when you're adapting a fairy tale, there's something about a fairy tale, and you kind of touched on this in the intro, that has to, by its very nature, encapsulate the cultural values of the place where it came from. And when you're adapting it to another culture, there's going to be a bit of a translation, not just in language, but in values as well. And especially because fairy tales tend to be very moralistic in a lot of ways, or at least a certain vein of them are, you see that translationary effect in a very clear, very evident sort of way, if you're familiar with both the original version and the adapted version. I guess to that extent too, like how much does the message of Pinocchio change in the Disney version compared to the original? I am not very familiar with the original. I've kind of like skimmed through the Wikipedia article of it, but it sounds like you're pretty familiar with it, Jonathan. So I know Pinocchio Disney puts a very big emphasis on the lying. Like they frame the whole story within that context from the very get-go. So what is that like the main focus? I don't think that's the main focus of Pinocchio, the novel. What's your takeaway on it?
Not necessarily. So we're going to talk about the 2019 version, which actually does a really surprisingly good job of taking the book and putting it on film.
The vibe I got was that the 2019 version was the most true to the book.
It is incredibly true. I mean, it's mostly just deviates in its reduction, which is necessary to put such a crazy book into a 2-hour film. But yeah, so really what you're kind of left with, which in a weirdly kind of literature nerd way, I kind of think of Pinocchio in similar vein to like Tom Jones, which no one's familiar with the history of Tom Jones anymore. But they both kind of focus on this main character who is striving towards the ideal and yet are constantly led astray, either out of ignorance or some kind of misguided desire. And that's something that I want to talk about through all of the fairy tales, is that one of the main things that I think we're going to see is that these fairy tales really, what they reveal is desire and the ways in which those are well-placed or misplaced. So I think we see that, and that's the other thing that Disney has done with this film in terms of the way that it is remembered now, is it starts with the wishing star. When you wish upon a star, makes no difference where you are or who you are. I don't remember. Something, it'll come true, And that's like what Disney itself is based on now. Like there's so much of Pinocchio
selling you on a dream, man.
Yeah, there's so much of Disney that is just based around kind of that element from Pinocchio. By the way, Pinocchio is the second Disney animated film that was produced. I think Snow White, or I think Sleeping Beauty was supposed to come out first, but then it got swapped somehow.
Oh, okay. Yeah, isn't Snow White the first one from the 30s?
Snow White's the first one, and we'll talk about that later. But yeah, so Pinocchio is really early. But yeah, so then I'm so interested in how much of Pinocchio is just like became what Disney was for a while and is still kind of those things that you think about with Disney. So you have the wishing star, you have Jiminy Cricket, and you have the fairy godmother waving her wand.
Yeah. Jiminy Cricket, who is not as prominent in the OG version of Pinocchio as he is in the Disney version.
Jiminy Cricket is almost whole cloth made for this film. And that's something that's also really interesting about what Disney did with this movie, because as we're going to see, maybe we should have started with the 2019 version, but as we're going to see, the cricket does pop up in the book and he has no name in the book. He's just the talking cricket. And he shows up right away in the book to give Pinocchio a lecture, and Pinocchio doesn't want to be lectured. He wants to do what he wants to do. So he throws a mallet at the cricket and kills it immediately.
Yeah, imagine that in a Disney movie.
Yeah. And he comes back later as a ghost, so it's kind of okay. But yeah, so the way that Disney has taken Jiminy Cricket, they gave him the name Jiminy Cricket, which I'm sure you're aware is basically like a Southern euphemism for Jesus Christ. So Jiminy Cricket is, again, that moralistic element, especially 1940s kids stories. You know, you have this moral guide who is also
sounds
the guide
slightly
for
like
the
Jimmy
audience
Stewart.
now.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. I mean, you got that from Puss in Boots too, right?
I did get that from Puss in Boots too.
That was the funniest thing in that movie.
But I did think that the way they elevated and incorporated the Jiminy Cricket was one to kind of refocus it on like the moral aspect as much as possible, draw a stronger through line through all of the episodic events, and to kind of give a voice to in the way he's presented. He feels like the moralistic character from other 1940s, 1930s movies, almost like Jimmy Stewart and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, the conscience on the shoulder of the United States Congress. So kind of standing in for like a moral idea of mid-century American good moral values in a lot of ways, which feels very 1940s Hollywood.
Oh yeah. And so the way that we are guided through the story by Jiminy Cricket really connects the audience to that element too, right? So you have Jiminy Cricket kind of just happens to wander into the house on the same day that Pinocchio comes to life. And then he's given this charge, but he's always 2 steps behind. You know, every time Pinocchio goes somewhere else, Jiminy Cricket is, well, actually, he debates with himself way more in this movie. I think it's hilarious in Guillermo's, where every time Pinocchio makes a bad decision, the cricket gets squashed. But here, it's like Jiminy Cricket's always like, well, Pinocchio might be fine on his own. I'll probably just, let him do his thing. He seems happy with Stromboli. And then he has to go and catch up. So he's not there constantly to lecture him. Even Jiminy Cricket is kind of figuring it out as we go along, which again is kind of emblematic for Pinocchio's emerging conscience, is that he doesn't quite know which direction is right and which one is wrong. So he's kind of, the cricket grows with Pinocchio. And then in terms of that, those elements of where Pinocchio is learning where his desires are right and wrong, we get to the Pleasure Island scene, which is so crazy for a kid's movie. Like Pinocchio and Dumbo, I think, have some of the scariest films from Disney in those early days, which Dumbo is just like them getting drunk for no reason. But in Pinocchio, here you have them literally smoking and drinking and then getting turned into jackasses. They also say jackass a surprising amount of times.
Well, when it's in reference to a donkey, it's not a swear word.
Yeah, it's just still, I don't think you would probably do it as much nowadays.
No, you would, because it would be very wink and nod.
But yeah, that whole scene, it's literally Pinocchio sitting there while, I think in this one, he's called Lampwick. In the translation that I read, and in Guillermo's, he's called Candlewick. But anyway, Lampwick is sitting there. He's doing pool. He's like literally in a pool hall. So it's giving kids this image of what is the bad thing to do, which is sitting there with a jug of beer in one hand and a cigar in the other hand, just chilling at a pool hall forever.
Mm-hmm. It is weird to see Pinocchio smoke a cigar. Very odd. That also feels like a very 1940s thing. I don't remember. I don't even know if there was a drinking age in 1940. I don't know, man. Like, who knows?
You weren't of it in 1940.
No.
Whatever it was.
Decidedly not. But yeah. I mean, it's a pretty crazy adaptation. And again, the pool hall feels like a very adaptation to like a mid-American, 20th century American idea of what a pleasure island would look like, right? Is like smoking cigars and playing pool. Whereas now, if you did that, that would feel incredibly out of touch. And it also wouldn't necessarily feel like an 1800s version of an Italian pleasure island either. It would just feel like weird and out of place. So yeah, that's another interesting.
What would the modern pleasure island be? Would it be like a rave?
Well, it depends. If the kids were actually like the age of Pinocchio, which I don't know, seems to be somewhere between like 9 and 11.
But warning against vices of like teenagers or like older teenagers.
I'm imagining like a super fun palace that has like all the food you could want, laser tag, an arcade, a party area that looks like a rave, all sorts of stuff like that.
So stuff that gives the impression of a rave, but still like a kid. Yeah.
Yeah. I can't see a full rave. It just feels so old. I guess in a sense of like what the pleasure island looks like in Pinocchio 1940, a rave would be more accurate. But in the sense of what the pleasure island looks like in Pinocchio 2019, the super fun arcade would be more accurate.
Yeah.
You know, the Pinocchio pleasure island in 1940 is uniquely adult in this very odd way. That I don't know if it was pleasant in the book.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that we're going to see in the next one that kind of comes more from the book is that the idea is more of the trap of Pleasure Island is that it's a slacker's paradise, right? Because Pinocchio avoids school, he avoids work to go play and do fun stuff. So this is driven home even more in the book that we'll touch on. So it's interesting that here it's almost adult vices in general, whereas in the book it's more because the school doesn't come up again once after he leaves the first time. But it really is him kind of running away from school, not wanting to do work, and instead wanting to play and do nothing all day. Yeah,
if in that sense it would be, heck, it wouldn't even be all the stuff I was talking about. It would be like a big room with a million VR sets that you lock into, and you can endlessly be in virtual worlds, and you would take pictures and post them on your virtual social media, and you would never unhook from the machine. Everything would be taken care of by the VR machine, like you were in a Matrix pod almost. But you would never actually achieve anything or do anything. Basically, Meta Pleasure Island, yes. That would be the modern version of this.
I can see that. So the next up, before we move off of this one, we do need to touch on the Monstro scene. So they give Monstro a little bit more characterization. Actually, the dogfish has a lot of characterization in the book. Like, they say he has asthma and heart problems and stuff.
Really?
Which is just kind of silly. Yeah, wow. That's why he ends up...
It's probably because he has a dude with lighting a freaking fire in his stomach every night.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, his dad goes off, he gets swallowed by the whale. So now Pinocchio has to go and be brave and rescue his dad. And so also it's interesting that in this version, Pinocchio doesn't fully turn into a donkey, because he does in the book and he does in the 2019 version. So here it's kind of conveying that if you turn your ways, you're not going to fully turn into a jackass,
Yeah.
Even if you've already started down that path. So he, by jumping, well, yeah, he jumps off the island and then he goes back home and realizes that Geppetto's gone. And then he goes back to the sea and ties a stone around himself and dives in to go find his dad because he knows he'll float. And that's really interesting because Pinocchio does end up in the sea with a stone tied around him in the original story, but he's cast in the sea by someone else, which again, we'll touch on in a second. But it's interesting that Pinocchio makes that decision to dive into the sea and then go save his father. And his dad is also, he has to then realize that like his dad's just going to sit there and live there and eat fish for the rest of his life. And Pinocchio's like, no, we got to go. We got to get out of here. Let's do something.
Yeah. So Geppetto's Pinocchio locked has in a darker version of Pleasure Island.
Kind of.
Pleasure Island.
Yeah. So then Pinocchio realizes like, hey, we can't do this. So we gotta make some choices and get out of here. And then, so I guess he although the interesting thing that I think I was trying to work out is his dad sees his donkey ears, and Pinocchio almost explains to him what happened, but then Geppetto cuts him off and says, never mind. I'm just so happy that you're here. So Pinocchio had kind of an intent to be truthful, but he didn't really have that full truth-telling catharsis.
We had to cut the animation for time and budget.
We didn't have time for him to explain the whole story. But yeah, because I mean, those are the three things, right? He's brave by jumping in after his dad. He's truthful because he realizes, I guess, that he should tell the truth after he lies the first time. And then unselfish, I guess, also by saving his dad. So then when they get out, he turns into a real boy.
There you go, man. Now you're a real boy. But no spazzatura in this one.
No spazzatura.
Is there spazzatura in the book?
No. So we'll get to that. But spazzatura is basically the cat. So Volpe is the fox and spazzatura is the cat. And then they kind of adjust.
I see.
Double as a couple different characters. Because Volpe is both Mangiafoco, who's the circus leader, and he's the fox at the same time.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah. Because they're separate characters in 2019, but similar characters in Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio. Man, it's really bugging me that his name's in the title now. It's so unnecessary. Anyway.
Yeah. They could have just called it something else, like a Pinocchio, a puppet's tale, or something like that, just to give the title something different.
Or if you want to do the modern reboot thing, call it Geppetto.
Or name it after the book, The Adventures of Pinocchio.
Yeah, anyway. There you go. That's a good one.
All right, so let's talk about our next version of Pinocchio from 2019. Jason, take us to Italy.
Pinocchio from 2019. A struggling carpenter decides to turn his fortunes around by making the most beautiful puppet in the world, but he gets more than he bargained for after being given a magical piece of wood that comes to life as soon as the puppet is finished. Geppetto is ecstatic to now be a babbo and trades his only coat and vest for school books so his new son Pinocchio can become educated. However, on his way to school, Pinocchio sells the school books for money to buy tickets to a traveling puppet show where he is captured by the stern puppet master Mangiafuoco, or Fire Eater. Pinocchio meets with many misfortunes in an attempt to get back home, including being arrested, lectured by a talking cricket, and assailed by bandits, but finds a friend and protector of sorts in the home of a dead girl with blue hair and magic abilities. This blue fairy encourages him to go to school and promises to make him a real boy if he is diligent. But just before she does, Pinocchio is led astray by a schoolfellow who convinces him to join a wagon full of other boys heading to the land of toys. Pinocchio has another series of misadventures before he is reunited with his father, who was swallowed by a monstrous dogfish while searching for Pinocchio. Pinocchio must rescue his father and subsequently learn the diligence needed to provide food and shelter for them both.
All right, Jonathan. This one, I hadn't read the book. I kind of looked at the bullet points of it, but this one I could tell just while watching it that it covers the most ground out of the book. It seems to be the most true, adherent, accurate adaptation out of this set that we've seen.
So I went ahead and read through the book audio version in prep for this podcast, and I would call this basically the definitive film version. It is there is some deviation. They do some things like the snail is not quite as big of a character, but they had some fun with the snail. I like what they did with her. But yeah, they covered a lot of the book. So actually in that respect, what is your impression of this film having come straight from Disney to whatever the heck is going on in Italy?
I liked this one a lot more than I liked the Disney one.
It's a lot more interesting.
Yeah, I found it a lot more interesting and intriguing. The Disney one is intentionally dumbed down. Like we talked about before, it's very efficient, it's very effective, it's very simple, but it's that for two reasons. One, to appeal to kids, because the main thrust of especially early animation in American cinema was that it was for kids and therefore it should be simple. And two, that it was condensed heavily for the sake of time and budgetary reasons. So it was kind of nice to kind of have like this, I wouldn't exactly call it languid, but slower paced story where we get to see Pinocchio as kind of more of a fleshed out character. I felt like he actually went on like not just a physical journey, but a journey of self-growth and discovery in this one. And it actually feels like this one tackled the question of, what if you were just thrust into existence as a 9-year-old wooden boy? What would that be like? That would be terrifying, wouldn't it? Like this kind of.
I love how the first thing that happens is he just runs away. Like Geppetto makes him, and he's not given life, which is a really interesting thing that, again, Disney added, is that the Blue Fairy comes and gives Pinocchio life. In the story,
the log just has life.
Yeah, he's an enchanted piece of wood. So the title of this podcast is a reference to the title of the first chapter of the book, which is The Piece of Wood That Laughed and Cried Like a Child. And so there's you see the two characters at the beginning of this story. There's the wood carver who has the wood, and he finds out that this wood is enchanted and is terrified. And then he schluffs it off on Geppetto. When Geppetto comes in, it's like, I want to make a puppet. And so then Geppetto realizes that the wood is alive as he's making Pinocchio. And then as soon as Pinocchio is made, he runs away. And it's
it's like, he just comes to life and starts screaming and running. And I've never seen a better metaphor for the pain of existence than that.
Yeah. Yeah. So he just runs away. I think actually in the book, he runs away and Geppetto runs after him. And then everyone assumes that Geppetto is abusing him. And so they put Geppetto in jail. And then Pinocchio goes back home and sits by the fire and burns his feet off, which again is another like kind of shocking moment if you're not prepared for Pinocchio to literally burn his legs off in a fire right away.
Right. Oh my gosh, I could accidentally die in a fire.
Yeah.
Mortality is pain.
And then that's also when we get the first glimpse of the cricket who comes out of the wall and says, hey, you should listen to your dad. Little boys who don't listen to their fathers and who are disobedient don't end well. And then Pinocchio kills him. In this movie, they just kind of like make it a joke thing where he throws the hammer and it hits the cricket and it kind of bounces off of him. But in the book, he just straight up kills him.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. In the book, is the cricket a small, grotesque monster that looks more like a small man than it does a cricket?
No, but I was going to talk about that.
Okay.
Yeah, in the book, he's just the talking cricket. So yeah, what's your impression of the Jim Henson-esque aspects of the film?
I kind of got the sense that they were inaccurate, but it kind of lends itself to what was going on. The whole thing kind of has a touch of camp and a touch of theatricality to it. So the representation of these animalistic talking animals, right, which are such a classic fairy tale thing, as humans in makeup, it fits the feel of the movie very well. And the idea
it almost feels like a marionette show in the amount of suspension of disbelief you have to go through.
Yeah. And also like the idea of not everything being glossy and super or the most ideal version of itself like it is in Disney is kind of nice, and I feel like probably a better thematic choice for a movie that is kind of about accepting all of the pains and the jackass of being a mortal. Like, learning to accept, how to treat other people, how to live with other people, even when those people aren't picture perfect or mortally perfect, and how to be a good person because it's worth it to just be a good person, and that's the right thing to do. I feel like that is captured in all the design choices. Like from an art direction standpoint and like a direction standpoint, I feel like this movie is on point for what it wants to do and its interpretation of Pinocchio.
It's really well done and like consistent across. Well, not completely consistent because you have things like the cat and the fox who are, they look like you're seeing a stage version of someone being a cat and a fox. But then you have the snail and the tuna, which are a snail and a tuna.
Yes. Oh, the tuna is terrifying. Oh my God.
The tuna is terrifying.
But yeah, I thought that all of the choices were very interesting. And I felt like all the way through, this one was probably the most interesting out of the three. I don't know if I could say it's the
First of all,
best.
It's unpredictable.
But yeah, exactly, right? Like, it's such a refreshing way to present the story, even though it's such a back to basics way of presenting the story. If that makes sense. And it's the least Disneyfied version of it. I think that's what's so refreshing, because we'll see with Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio. Oh, I hate saying that now. Even that one is kind of more of a take on the Disney version of the story. Than it is a different interpretation of the original narrative, which is very interesting. And again, makes me a little unhappy with the dominance of Disney in the fairy tale market.
We'll talk about the merits and caveats of that in a second.
Yeah.
But what was the most surprising episode in this one that you don't expect after coming from the Disney version?
You know what? It was really kind of subtle, but the way the carnival arc ended was much different.
Yes, because Mangiafoco is not a monster.
Yeah, because that character is often like either a total monster or combined with other characters. Mm-hmm. So the way it ended was like, oh, I was not expecting that. That was around the time when I really started perking up. The first moment was when the log of wood was already alive.
Yeah.
And that guy thought he was drunk. One, that was hilarious. And two, it was just different than what I was used to. And then I find out now that's originally how it was in the book. And then the carnival scene ended differently. And from that point, I was like, okay, we're off to a very different situation here. I'm very curious to see what's going to go and happen. Then that, and of course, the feeling, I feel like this one sets up Pinocchio really well as a character who actually grows over the course. I don't just mean his nose, but like actually grows over the course of the movie. Like you can see him struggling to figure out what's going on in the world. And then especially around the midpoint, there's a point where he tells the cat and the fox to just get lost. He's like, I'm done with you guys. And I was like, this is really nice to see, because you can see him trying to be a better person. He's like, I'm not even messing with you. Get the heck out of here.
Yeah.
I'm a good boy now. Bye. And just bounces.
Yeah. So, oh man. Yeah. There's so much more in this one. So you have things like the blue fairy, who's like a ghost and a fairy at the same time. The introduction to her is the same in the movie and in the book. He's being chased by, he doesn't realize it's the cat and the fox in assassin outfits, but he's being chased by them. And then he gets hung to the tree, which they actually showed in this one. I was surprised to see. So they hang Pinocchio to try and get his money, which he swallows. They don't show that very well, but he like eats the money and hides it under his tongue. And then he won't open his wooden mouth for them. And then he lies about that to the fairy. But when he goes to the fairy's house, she says, there's no one here. I'm dead and everyone else is dead here. And he's like, oh, okay, crap. And then he gets hung and she rescues him eventually. So she starts off as a little girl, though, and she's kind of this sisterly character. And then when she comes back later, he runs into her again later and she's full grown, and then she becomes kind of a motherly character. And then she comes back again in the book as a goat, but we're not even going to get into that. She
actually, speaking of four-legged animals, I was also very surprised to see Pinocchio become a full jackass and then perform as the jackass. You don't see that in the Disney version.
And that we have to get into because, at least at some point. So yeah, Pinocchio goes through a series of misadventures. And I think, again, like you were saying, this film does a really good job of conveying this feeling of being a child and just encountering this world that feels kind of scary. Sometimes people who seem scary at first are actually, going to help you out. Like Mangiafoco, who's the puppet master in the story. Mangiafoco means fire eater. So he has a really intimidating name, first of all.
And he had other living puppets.
Yeah. So, the way that those puppets are alive is never explained. But, somehow they're both not living boy puppets like Pinocchio, but they're also kind of have a life of their own somehow or other. But he captures Pinocchio, and then he's going to use him as wood on his fire to eat his food. And then he relents because Pinocchio tells him about his dad and all that, and then he's going to use another puppet, and Pinocchio saves that puppet. So he kind of has this soft spot to him. So he's like this really intimidating character who has this soft spot. And then, the world is scary and contradictory. Things are really confusing, like the scene where he gets arrested and they say, if you're innocent, you must go to prison. And he says, but I'm a criminal. And they say, oh, well, then you can go free. It's just that things don't make sense to kids sometimes. And then so the different characters that he learns to trust and not trust, like the cat and fox who are going to, hit their get rich quick scheme that they keep trying to push on him and then trying to steal his money all the time. And then, by the time we get to this point, so we get back to the point where Geppetto has left and Pinocchio can't find him. And then, or Pinocchio goes off and jumps into the sea to try and follow Geppetto, and then washes back up on shore, and he is again brought to the Blue Fairy's house, who's now a full-grown woman, and she teaches him to go back to school and to work really hard, and then she'll make him a real boy. So in this one, the focus is a lot on diligence and work, right? So he has to go to school, he has to work hard, and then he can become a real boy. And then right at the last second, before he becomes a real boy, Candlewick takes him on the cart to Pleasure Island, where they don't have to work ever, and all they have to do is play. And then they turn into full jackasses and they get sold off. So this is something that Disney trims out, but it's really important to the way that the actual story is moralizing goes, because Pinocchio performs in the circus, which is ironic because he is literally like his whole life is trying to get away from being a performing puppet. And so that's what he has to do as a donkey. And then after he breaks his leg, they throw him in the sea. And then the Blue Fairy turns him back into a puppet. And then he finds his father. They get out of the dogfish. And then the story's not over, because then they get to this little cottage, which is not explained, but the cricket buys from the Blue Fairy as a goat. Is really confusing.
Makes perfect sense to me.
Anyway, they get this little cottage, but then they have to make money to get some food, and so they go to the next cottage over, and Pinocchio has to work to earn money for his family to support his father. And another thing that's not in this movie, which I can understand, but it's also such a poignant part of the book, is that Pinocchio takes the job of pushing the mill wheel to pull the water up or whatever, right? So the reason he has to do that is that this other guy, his donkey, has been overworked to the point of death, and he couldn't handle the work. And Pinocchio goes in and realizes that it's Candlewick as a donkey has been worked to death because he couldn't handle the work, because that was his whole thing, is running away from diligence and work. And so he dies right there, like in Pinocchio's arms, and Pinocchio does the work.
Or his hoofs.
No, Pinocchio's a boy. He's back to being a puppet at that point.
Ah, I see.
So then Pinocchio picks up his work and does it. And after being diligent and supporting his father, then he becomes a real boy. So it's really like Pinocchio has to literally work to become a real boy. And it's not even guaranteed at that point that he will become a real boy, but he just does it because that's what a good son does. So there's this whole like extra layer to the story that you get more of a sense of in this version than you do in the Disney version.
Yeah. I was about to say, with every episode that passes in Pinocchio 2019, I feel like Pinocchio learns something and grows. With every episode that passes in Disney 1940, I feel like we had a fun, nicely animated adventure.
Yeah, and you get kind of an on the nose. Don't be a drunken drunken smoker.
1940 just wasn't setting out to be the rigorous moral tale that exists in the original fairy tale or in some of the other adaptations of the film.
Yeah, we could talk about every little bit of that one, but I think that because I had read it, so I was kind of, once I realized that it was going to be faithful, I was expecting a lot of it, but I don't know what it would be like to go into this one blind. I
guess on a larger scale, one of the things that I did come away with was that it had a particularly, it was almost like a fantastical Dickensian coming of age novel. Something almost like Great Expectations,
Yeah.
where you follow a kid who through his misadventures and his misconceptions about the world until he
Even Oliver
learns about
Twist
it.
almost.
And especially, Oliver Twist too, and especially a world in which most adults, not all adults, but most adults tend to be arbitrarily cruel towards most people and especially children. That felt it's something that's there, I think, in this narrative for the purpose of the specific journey that Pinocchio has to go on. But you see,
And it
that
also
in a lot of
contrasts
Dickensian
Geppetto
tales as well.
as a good father.
Yeah.
That is a desirable place to end
Yeah,
back up
that
at.
Pinocchio initially rebels against. Not really because he dislikes Geppetto, just because he doesn't want to listen to anyone.
Yeah.
Because, that's a typical kid and early teenager thing to just, want to assert yourself and your independence. And then you realize that, some of the adults in my life are maybe not terrible, and maybe we're trying to help and give me good advice and sheltered place. And, some of the other ones out there that are trying to sell me on something are not the best to listen to. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
Yeah, and to that end, it's really interesting that I was just thinking of it in the terms that you're talking about. It's interesting that he meets the Blue Fairy as a child, because she ends up putting the strictest guidelines on him, but she kind of gets into his good graces by being on his level, right? So they play together, they, spend time together, and he has this familial sisterly affection for her before she becomes something of an authority figure over him, telling him what to do. So she already has that rapport with him that then, and by that point in the story, he's already had enough misadventures that he realizes that she's someone he should listen to, which also means that his betrayal of that is something that is willful. It's not done out of ignorance. It's done because he knows that he would rather not do what she says. And so that's where he gets his biggest consequences too. So that's really interesting in that element of her being on his level, letting him let his guard down, but still having expectations for him.
Yeah, right. She kind of changes to reflect how Pinocchio views her over the course of the movie. First, which fits with an amorphous fairy character, right? Like originally she's just somebody who could be a friend or a potential play companion. And then eventually she becomes just another adult figure who he doesn't want to listen to. And then a kind of a motherly figure who he realizes is worth listening to.
Yeah. There's a lot there. There's a lot to unpack from the story that comes from the book. And I think it's a really good addition just to see, this is how it comes. This is how you do kind of that kind of adaptation. And I really love, again, the look of the film really does a good job of conveying this whole fairy tale kind of atmosphere in a way that I don't think has been replicated very well by other people doing live action fairy tale adaptations.
I don't know. I haven't seen the other live action adaptation. The Zemeckis one, I have not seen it.
I have not either. I'm avoiding
At least
it.
it's not called Robert Zemeckis' Pinocchio.
He probably doesn't want his name that closely attached to it. One thing to note about this before we move off of it, though, is that Geppetto, Roberto Benigni, who directed Life is Beautiful and starred in Life is Beautiful, which is an award-winning film, he also played Pinocchio in a version from the early 2000s. So he was Pinocchio in that version, and he directed that film, and then he comes back to be Geppetto in this version. So I just think that's an interesting little connection there. He's very attached to this story, apparently.
I mean, he's Italian, man. It's a requirement.
Is Roberto Benigni. This sounds so Italian. All right, well, let's move on and talk about Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio from 2022. Jason, take it away.
Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio from 2022. After his son Carlo is killed in an unplanned air raid during the First World War, an aging carpenter named Geppetto plants a perfect pine cone near Carlo's grave. Years later, still grieving the loss of his son, Geppetto cuts down the tree, which is now home to an aspiring author named Sebastian J. Cricket, and uses the wood to fashion a puppet in the form of a young boy. This is all witnessed by a wood sprite who, after Geppetto falls asleep in a drunken stupor without having finished the puppet, names the puppet Pinocchio, gives him life, and promises Sebastian one wish if he will accept the charge of teaching Pinocchio right from wrong. When Geppetto finds his puppet alive the next morning, he has mixed feelings about the enthusiastic and strong-willed boy, and so does the rest of the town after Pinocchio follows Geppetto to work. The town podesta orders Pinocchio to go to school, but on the way, he signs a contract with Volp, the master of a traveling circus, to become one of his acts. When Geppetto tries to retrieve him, Pinocchio is accidentally killed. He wakes up in a coffin and meets the sister of the sprite who gave him life. She explains that he cannot truly die because he is not a real boy, but every time he is killed, he will have to stay a little longer in death before returning to the land of the living. With the Italian army now interested in a boy who can't die, Pinocchio leaves Geppetto and Sebastian to fulfill his contract with Volp. As a performer of propaganda for Mussolini, and later a soldier for the Italian army, Pinocchio must learn the proper time and place for obedience and disobedience, and eventually rescue his father and Sebastian, who are lost at sea and have been swallowed by a dogfish while chasing the trail of Volp's circus.
I find that I really like this as a movie. I wouldn't say it's my favorite adaptation of the story, though. I find parts of the adaptation to be very clever, but overall, and I think I mentioned this before already, but I find it to be more of a take on the Disney version of Pinocchio than it is on the original take of Pinocchio, if you catch my drift. Like, a lot of it is very, like, connected to that, even down to, like, the songs, which are present, but always feel like they end really fast. Like, they're not full musical numbers. They're almost like short little ditties. And sometimes they make a lot of sense because it's part of a performance. And other times it's like we're in a musical, but we're never really in a musical.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's not your Disney type of musical, but there is music used to kind of amplify the pathos in the film, which I think it does a good job of doing that.
Yeah, it just feels like, and I think the music for me was another part that it was like, okay, we're building off of the Disney version here, aren't we? More than we are building off of the OG version, which isn't a bad thing. It's just one of my pet peeves that the Disney version's so dominant in the perception of it. I think the other thing to note with kind of just as something big to note before we dive too much into the adaptation, is that it's Guillermo del Toro. And if we're doing a story set in Europe, it's a prerequisite that it has to be connected to World War II or the Spanish Civil War. And so it's connected to those. Yeah.
Which we'll get into. But I want to comment first on the adaptation of the Disney adaptation. So it is that, and I was actually just making a list for myself of all those elements. So it's guided by the cricket. The blue fairy comes and gives Pinocchio life. He doesn't have life of himself. Although we have a second blue fairy, which we'll get into, which is super interesting. Yeah. But there's also some of these things that are pulled a little bit more from the book. So, I mean, there's actually more of just nods to the book, like Pinocchio burns his feet in the fire, which was a fun thing to see. And I think that the fact that, like I said, every time Pinocchio does the wrong or goes in the wrong direction, the cricket is literally squashed and, for all intents and purposes, killed.
Yeah, that's a good symbol.
Is kind of a nod back to the book. But yes, I think it's very interesting that this story, because one of the things that we said in the setup of fairy tales is that fairy tales take place in a really undefined land, fairy tale world, once upon a time in somewhere far, far away. Is that when you take that and you put it, and did you watch the behind the scenes clip?
I did not.
That goes along with this? Okay, so there's a little bit of a behind the scenes clip where Guillermo del Toro gives a little bit of his thoughts on the film. But part of it is that putting this in the real world, and not only the real world, but probably the realest of the real world, which is in between both of the world wars, where you have just all of the tension and the moral, conundrums and pitfalls going on, is that it lends more magic to the magical elements, specifically the magical elements of Pinocchio. Because really, aside from Pinocchio and the fact that Pinocchio and Geppetto understand the cricket, there's nothing else that's legitimately magical. Spazzatura is a little anthropomorphized, but he doesn't talk. There are no other talking animals. But
unless you count the other side, which now has like a built-up lore to it, as well as a big, mysterious, all-powerful beast in another world, which again is very Guillermo del Toro.
Yeah. So we'll get there, but yeah, you have the fairies, both of the blue fairies, death. But in the real world, you have Pinocchio and you have the cricket, and those are the only really magical elements. And so the fact that everything else in the real world is real, and Guillermo del Toro goes into how much history they even put in things like the old Italian church, which just has layers of frescoes and mosaics built into it, like a church would from that time period. The reality just makes Pinocchio stand out even more in terms of the feeling of the story. And I think that is, that at least is achieved.
Yeah, I'll also say that for an adaptation, we talked about how the Disney adaptations seem to have a bit of a problem making the episodic structure fit into a movie 3-act structure. I feel like this one does a much better job of that from a structural standpoint. And it does that.
Although Guillermo del Toro writes his own episodes, but it still has kind of that adventure feel to it.
They're episodes, but the through lines exist between each episode. It's not like we reset every time.
Yeah.
So like characters like Candlewick are introduced very early on. Like very early, before they really become majorly relevant to the plot, which makes them feel part of a connected story more so than the resetting of the appearance of Candlewick feels like in the 1940 version does, where it's like, okay, here's a brand new character for a brand new story. No, this is another character who's going through the same crazy world that Pinocchio is, and honestly is struggling with a lot of the same things that Pinocchio is struggling with, like, how do I be a good boy? Do I listen to my fascist father, or do I escape that and find my own definition of good that isn't laced with this stuff that inherently does not feel right to me? Oh
gosh, this is a whole can of worms. But finish your point.
And then having that started and having him on the same kind of moral track and a parallel track, if you will, as Pinocchio does over the course of the story, makes it feel more connected when he appears later on. We actually see something very similar with Spazzatura, who is basically turned into a child character.
Has a redemption arc, yeah.
Yeah, and it has a redemption arc as he kind of breaks a cycle of abuse, much like Candlewick does over the course of the movie. And then, of course, you have the potentially added element, I don't know, you tell me, Jonathan, of Pinocchio being immortal for the first chunk of the movie.
So interesting. So before we get into Pinocchio's mortality, this one of the things about having all those cohesive elements is that Guillermo del Toro has packed this film with foils. And I'm pretty sure we've talked about this before, but if you recall in your high school English class, a foil is a character in a film that is kind of on the same trajectory or some kind of a mirror image of your protagonist or one of your main characters, but chooses a different path. And so then, you get to see what would happen if your main character made a different decision or something along those lines. So it's kind of, in some sense, it's like a red shirt where you have someone who just shows you like how bad the bad side is or whatever. But really, this film is just full of them, from, like you said, Candlewick's relationship to his father, who's a fascist military leader. And Pinocchio is trying to reconcile that with his strained relationship with his father, who is a loving father, but is dealing with grief and is sometimes not perfect in the way that he loves Pinocchio. And then you have Pinocchio trying to learn. So this one, again, I think each of these films focuses on a different element that all kind of play parts from the original story, but each one of these films brings it to the core. So this one, I think there's a focus on obedience, and there's a focus on knowing when obedience is required and justified, when disobedience is required and justified, and where those lines cross. Because you have Pinocchio learning that, obeying his father is a good thing, but not obeying Volpe is a good thing, or the Podesta, And so you have Pinocchio, and again, given the setting, you have Pinocchio learning what authority is, and what authority is good and what authority is not good in a context of fascist Italy. So you have constant examples of bad uses of authority while Pinocchio is trying to learn that his father and the cricket are good examples of authority. And you have him learning when to, follow the rules and break the rules. So you have Death, who has the strictest rules that cannot be broken. And yet on Earth, he has to find times and places to, where he breaks the rules in a way that's not good, and then he has some kind of consequence, or he breaks the rules in a way that he should, like when he has to lie in the dogfish to get out of the dogfish. Again, bringing in that Disney element of, the nose growing being a huge deal. So there's all of these contrasts that are put in there. And again, it makes each episode feel like we're taking this Rubik's Cube of what it means to be obedient and good and loving, and we're turning it in all these different sides. And every time we turn to a different side, we change something. And then by the end, we have a somewhat complete Rubik's Cube. Yeah,
right. It's learning about how to be alive through a million different examples of right and wrong, which is pretty accurate to real life. Except for the death part, which feels like you're just taking a break from the movie and stepping into Guillermo del Toro's brain, and then we step back into the movie.
Yeah, but it is fascinating because it really adds this other fairy tale element. So in it, in this, Pinocchio is able to die, but he can't fully die, so he has to come back to life until he breaks the rules, giving him a choice of mortality in order to save his father. So you have this element of choosing mortality out of love, right? Love for his father, which all that is still a super fairy tale element if you think of like The Little Mermaid. And I guess the mortality element isn't really brought up in Disney. But if you go back to the story, The Little Mermaid chooses a mortal life in order to be with the prince, who ultimately doesn't choose her back, and so she dies. But it's the same kind of thing, right? It's this desire for this human life, this human soul, but that comes with consequences. The consequence of having to die for real. And then even those rules are broken. We have the eucatastrophe at the end of this film, where Pinocchio does choose mortality, does give up his life to save his father, and then the cricket gets the wish to bring him back. And so again, the wishing, not necessarily wishing star, but kind of that element from Disney is brought in here, but it's kind of all brought in a much more grounded film here.
Mm-hmm. Even the cricket having to earn and then use the wish at the end of the movie is a good example of the restructuring of the plot to make more sense as a condensed movie than as a longer episodic tale.
Oh yeah, and here's the other thing. So I think, this is going back to your point that Disney overwhelms everything. Though I think that the reason Guillermo del Toro probably isn't too concerned about that is because in using Disney's version and something that is so culturally ingrained, you can really spot those differences, and where Guillermo del Toro makes a change stands out more. So you can catch the point that he's making more. For example, we lose the fun little side characters from Disney's Pinocchio with the cat Figaro. Shout out, looks just like my cat, Sylvester. And the little fish character, because in Disney's version, Geppetto is trapped in Monstro with the cat and the fish. Those are his companions. In this film, Pinocchio leaves the cricket behind, and so halfway through the film, the cricket is now companion to Geppetto, and he sits in Geppetto's shirt pocket in the same place where he is in Pinocchio's heart at the beginning of the film. The cricket becomes Geppetto's conscience halfway through the film, right? And then Geppetto's trapped in the well with the cricket. And so that's a really interesting change too, is seeing that element, because in this film, Geppetto has to have a character arc as well.
Yeah, he actually has a character arc. Yep.
He goes from the grieving of his son, who for all intents and purposes is the perfect son, named Carlo, by the way, if you remember. Carlo Collodi wrote the book.
I'm guessing there was no Carlo in the original book.
No. No, like in the 2019 version where they have the piece of wood, that's just where it starts with Geppetto getting the wood.
That's what I figured.
So Carlo is a huge thing. So that presents the other foil, which is a huge aspect of the film, which is this contrast between perfection and imperfection, right? So you have Carlo, who's kind of upheld, not to say that he was a perfect boy, for all intents and purposes in the story, he was the perfect son, right? He did whatever his father wanted. They had such a great life together. And so Geppetto has this perfect memory, and that's represented by the perfect pine cone that he plants and then, makes Pinocchio out of. But Pinocchio is not the perfect boy, and he's unfinished, right? So he makes Pinocchio in a drunken stupor and doesn't even finish him. He says, "I'll finish you in the morning." So Pinocchio is this imperfect son now, and Geppetto has to learn how to love him the same as his other son, who's now dead. And so you have this contrast of Geppetto being a perfectionist, but still having to love and care for his other son, who is not perfect, but who is striving, right? So Pinocchio is still trying to do the right thing, even though he gets misled still.
Yeah, I think part of our impression, too, of Carlo is a little bit of an unreliable narratorship.
Subjective,
where it's nobody's actually perfect, right? Like, that's not a thing. So part of it is being remembered through some rose-tinted glasses, and I'm sure Carlo had flaws as well. But for the sake and purposes of the story, that's not relevant, because Pinocchio isn't competing with Carlo. He's competing with the memory of Carlo, which is different. Yeah. Now, here's a question. What did you think about, I guess it would be your eucatastrophe, the incredibly surprisingly long ending of the movie that is incredibly sad and odd?
Yeah, so that's a good question, because it ultimately brings the element of mortality to a head, right? So because
Pinocchio is still he's not immortal in the sense at the end of the movie that if he dies again he'll be brought back, but
he's
he doesn't
more like an
age.
elf from Tolkien. He's more like so he could probably be killed, but he doesn't age. So if he just doesn't do something to get himself killed, then he'll probably live forever.
To die, he'll be okay. And I like, it's so weird how they just allude to he's out there somewhere. It's so odd. I like the idea though that at the end it's like the value of a life is that it is limited. But I feel like that was already achieved before slowly killing off all of his companions.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't exactly have a thought on what the intention of Pinocchio riding off into the sunset is. Although I will say that I part of Guillermo del Toro's impression of this film is, instead of Pinocchio, having to become a good boy and become better by choosing a bunch of wrong paths, this film really focuses on how the characters around Pinocchio are changed because of him. And the way
that's a big side effect of giving them all character arcs. Yeah,
and the way Guillermo del Toro frames it, like Pinocchio is kind of this pure character, even though he doesn't, he's not perfect, but he always kind of has the pure intentions.
Yeah, he's completely ignorant of the world, so he doesn't understand. He doesn't
kind of innocence.
He doesn't have a moral compass built So he just is like innately innocent in most of his decision making. And when he does make a bad decision, it's normally just because he's been misled and just listens to people.
Yeah. So a lot of the film is how all the other characters are changed by Pinocchio rather than how Pinocchio does have his arc, but the other characters have strikingly stronger arcs. So Candlewick gets his sympathetic arc, which does not happen in the other book, although he almost dies, although they don't actually kill him off.
They don't. Yeah, they don't. I don't think they actually kill him off. It's kind of left. He seems
I think
to
you
escape.
see him alive. Yeah.
Yeah.
Spazzatura gets his character arc. Volpe is the only one who doesn't really, but Volpe and the Podesta, but they're the fascist characters that we don't want to feel that sympathetic for.
I think they both die.
Volpe, well, the Podesta definitely does. I can't remember. I think Volpe does. I think he gets thrown off the cliff.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Spazzatura falls in the water, and Volpe very painfully falls on a rock.
Yeah. So, and Volpe is an interesting character too in terms of condensement because he is Mangiafoco, which again stands for fire eater, and it's interesting because they built. So, if you remember the strongman character from in the background of the circus, the strongman is the original character design for Mangiafoco that they were gonna use as the bad guy, but Guillermo del Toro didn't like how stereotypically like big and bad he looked, so they changed him, put him in the background, and then they brought out Volpe. So Volpe is the Italian word for fox. Volpe is the word that's used in the story for the fox, and so he plays the fox character and kind of the Mangiafoco character, and at the same time they were saying in his character design with his hair sticking straight up, he also has this devilish kind of appearance. So he's playing kind of the ultimate bad guy in the story. And he's also kind of the foil for, he is the bad father because he kind of takes Pinocchio under his wing, but he's an abusive father, an abusive authority figure in a smaller scale to, like an actual fascist leader. And then Spazzatura has this rebellion against him after Pinocchio is literally about to get crucified.
Yep. Again, I got to give it to Cate Blanchett. She can act as anything, including a abused monkey.
Yep, the abused monkey who has revolutionary spirit. So yeah, and then we do have the dogfish scene, the Dark Night of the Soul, where Pinocchio goes, and then this time he has a little bit more of. They have this adventure to escape where Geppetto tells Pinocchio to lie and keep lying so that his nose grows. Or actually, I think Pinocchio comes up with that idea, but Pinocchio keeps lying so that they can escape.
It's a good example of Pinocchio learning that there are rules, but also there's some times where you gotta break the rules. Like you should listen to authority, unless that authority is downright evil. Right. You shouldn't lie unless lying saves everybody.
Yeah, exactly. Which is a lesson that a lot of people had to learn in World War II when you're having to lie to save people's lives.
By the way, I don't know if we said it explicitly, but I find it hilarious that instead of the boys being turned into jackasses in the donkey sense, they're turned into jackasses in the fascist sense. It's essentially
we didn't even mention
Guillermo
that,
del Toro saying that Nazis and fascists are jackasses, which is pretty funny. And also the scene where they're having all that fun during the mini war games is just so intentionally dissonant that it is terrifying and dark.
Yeah. So to clarify, the Pleasure Island becomes fascist boot camp. Think Hitler Youth, but whatever the equivalent of that is in Italy. And so, because Pinocchio, they realize he can't actually die, so he would be a great soldier because he could just keep coming back and fighting for us. And so, but then him and Candlewick have this realization that they shouldn't be fighting, and then they try to come to this resolution. So yeah, the Pleasure Island becomes a fascist boot camp, which is the most ironically hilarious thing.
Deeply dark and plays into all of the themes and plot lines that we've been talking about already.
Yeah.
But anyway, we were getting to the dogfish and how they escaped by using lying and selective intentional breaking of the rules when that's what's called for.
So again, those rules are contrasted, and I guess we can get into the whole death element now, because you have rules that Pinocchio is learning that he can break, and then death has rules that must be followed. So right at the beginning of the story, we have a few rules that Pinocchio breaks, and he shouldn't be breaking them. Like, he needs to listen to his dad, and they have some consequences, but he's still kind of laughing them off because he still has this super innocence about him, and he feels like he's invincible, blah, blah, blah. And then he gets to death, and death is like, you're going to stay here until this timer runs out. And every time you're going to stay here a little bit longer until eternity. Is a little confusing that they don't specify how long, because then you get back in the story and you have no idea how much time has passed. But you kind of pick that up as you go. But anyway, death becomes in the most, I guess, flat use of the term. She dictates what, life is what it's going to be like for him. And he can't change that, right? So she is the dictator. She's represents some kind of nature rules cannot be broken. But he does get this one chance when he breaks the rule to go back immediately, and that's what gives him his mortality. So you could break the rule once, but then you can never come back again after that. And so, then he gets that choice of mortality that we already talked about. But again, it's all of these contrasts of when to break the rules, what kind of authority to follow, and it just creates this huge kind of mosaic or tapestry of this whole idea. But it's still wrapped up in this fantasy element. And we should also mention the fact that this is stop motion. So literally all the characters are puppets, which is the most meta integrated thing into this particular story.
Well, weren't the real puppets the friends we made along the way? I guess in this movie, yes, because they were all puppets.
They were all puppets, and they were literally made along the way.
All right, man. I mean, I don't think there's much else to talk about unless you want to slide into overall notes, because at this point, we're going to get pretty big with the ideas.
Let's do it. So on that note, something that I've been trying to hold off on until we get here is I want to talk about that idea of fantasy that Tolkien, brings up as one of the virtues of fairy tales. And it's interesting that the way that he talks about it, he says, when you think about fantasy as imagination, pretty much the only way to convey pure imagination is through words. So whether that's orally or written, when you are reading or listening to a story, you are fully imagining it. And so any other form of presenting fantasy strips out some element of that imagination, right? But I think here we see a good range. And Tolkien really disliked fantasy in any kind of dramatic form. He even said that he doesn't like watching the witches from Macbeth because they lose their fantastic element when he sees them on stage, which is super interesting. But here, film gives another kind of element to it, because not only do you have to make humans pretend to be whatever the fantastic elements are on a stage, which only has so much depth, and you have to build fake sets and all that kind of stuff. Film, you get a little bit more freedom with that. And I think in this selection of films, we see three really interesting ways of presenting fantasy that are a little more, I guess, involved than stage or some kind of dramatic production. So you have fully illustrated, so you can literally draw anything that you can imagine, but then of course you're left with what the animators were imagining still. You have the live action version in which you're still having people dress up as the fantastic elements. And then you have the stop motion version, which is kind of a blend, because you can make all your sets, you can make everything as fantastic as you want, but you're still filming it in real, photographs, and like it's still happening in reality, but it's just given extra life through motion. So I just think it's this really interesting kind of meta look at what art is and what fantasy is, in a way that we don't often talk about when we're talking about how to adapt fairy tales.
I mean, you always have to make a choice, right, about how connected to reality you want the thing you're making to be. Every choice towards stylization, whether it be the way you color something, like how a huge portion of Pinocchio 2019 is colored very deeply blue, or whether or not you're going to do animation. Every layer of stylization takes people further away from reality. And on the other end of the spectrum, you can make something that feels very down to earth and grounded. That's a whole spectrum of filmmaking that can, as you said, either encourage the audience to participate in the imagination or to submerge them more fully in the grounded nature of the story you're trying to tell.
Yeah. And there's another element to that, which is choosing which elements you show and which elements you imply, which there's not huge examples of that here, but just in general filmmaking terms, we've talked about things like using ellipsis to imply things, or don't show the shark, right? Because there are ways that you can, in film, incorporate more of the active human imagination by not showing them. So there's also a lot of choices that are made in terms of what do you actually put in front of the camera and what do you kind of reserve and let them be fully imaginative elements.
Right? It's kind of like what we talk about with horror all the time. Like, how much do you show the monster? You know, if you're going to go, if you're going to go whole hog on presenting something like, you know, The Host, then you got to go whole hog on it. Or otherwise you can just let the imagination steer the train, which can be a very powerful and very personal experience. Of course, one with a variety of success, depending on the individual audience member's ability to imagine.
Right. But that's the danger of literature too. So
It's a grounded, I think it, like you said, or suggested, it's a kind of like a grounded part of what's necessary about fairy tales, right? They're fireside stories from days of yore. They are all about imagination. That's the heart and soul of it. You know, imagine sitting in a dark, medieval, primordial German forest with a small crackling fire and shadows all around you, and being told about how kids turn into donkeys and die if they don't obey their parents. That's a much more gripping take than a fully CGI'd, photorealistic version seen on screen.
Yeah. So I think that's something that we're going to see come up throughout this series, because we're going to have a range of films, a lot of live action, a lot of animation, 2D animation, 3D animation, and just kind of keep that in mind as we're watching through these films and think about each medium and the limitations that it has, because each of them have their limitations in terms of portraying fantasy, right? So it all impacts our impression of the story and the fantasy that we're experiencing. But also just in terms of Pinocchio as kind of a kickoff to this series, I think it has a ton of these elements that we're going to see come up over and over again when we're talking about fairy tales. It has a lot of those archetypes built into it. And just in terms of the fact that it is kind of an adventure, we get a lot of them picked up along the way. It almost has a hero's arc to it, which, what's his name? Joseph Campbell's hero arc, which comes from psychology and a couple other things, but it's really similar also to a guy named Vladimir Propp, who has a whole concept of morphology, specifically from Russian folktales. Morphology just meaning all the elements that make up a thing. And so he takes a lot of the elements from Russian folktales and really dissects them, and they almost line up exactly with the common hero's arc from Joseph Campbell. So even that goes back to like a fairy tale, folktale kind of an origin. But here in Pinocchio, we see things like fulfilled desires and wishes in both good and bad, because we have things like Geppetto's wish for Pinocchio to become alive is fulfilled, but then Pinocchio's wish to live a carefree life is fulfilled, but that's not a good wish. We have things like fairy godmothers or magical protectors. Parent-child relationships are going to be coming up a lot. Talking animals, transformation is a huge thing. Favors given and then returned come up all the time in fairy tales. Like, if you help one bird in the forest, they're probably going to save you from being killed later on. And then to that extent, you also have like deception from people that you thought you were trusting. And then that element of the eucatastrophe, the happy ending. They all kind of shown here, and we're going to pick up a lot of these elements in many other fairy tales as we go through the rest of the series.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I mean, the world of fairy tales is very, very, very broad and deep and has a million different versions of everything because, I don't know, humans. This one is very close to what makes humans tick as storytellers. These are the stories we tell amongst ourselves before there was a way to record and really make profit from them. So this is saying a lot about people diving into fairy tales like this, and I think that should be interesting to take a look at. But what are we talking about specifically next time on the show, Jonathan?
Yeah, so next time we're going to take this and we're going to do kind of the next 2 episodes will be 2 sides of the same coin. So there's always this debate of, are fairy tales for kids or are fairy tales for more than kids? And so we're going to dive into the fairy tales are for kids aspect, which is decidedly the Disney take. And so we're going to do a deep dive on Disney fairy tale films. And we're going to also use it as kind of a through line to look at 3 different eras of Disney. So we have lots of layers going on. So we're going to start with, as we mentioned before, the very first Disney fairy tale, the very first feature-length animated film ever, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs from 1937. And then we're going to jump ahead to the Disney Renaissance with Beauty and the Beast from 1991. And finally, we're going to talk about the inexplicable runaway hit of Frozen from 2013. And all of these have really kind of traditional origins. So we have the Brothers Grimm with Snow White. We have Beauty and the Beast, which I cannot pronounce the lady's name who wrote that. But she didn't write a lot of other stuff, but it has just become so iconic of a story that it's really a good one to kind of touch on. And then Frozen from Hans Christian Andersen. So we'll have lots of range of sources and stuff to talk about.
Well, that's about all the time we have for this episode.
To find links to things that we talked about today, as well as a complete list of past episodes and all 465 films we've covered so far, visit thefilmlings.com.
You can also join us for ongoing film discussions on our Discord server.
And to stay posted about upcoming episodes, follow us on Twitter at thefilmlings.
Summaries for this week's episode were recorded by me, Blue Jay. You can discover more about what I do at thebluejayproject.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya.
Puss in Boots.
In Boots. That has been stuck in my head. The way he says it, it's been stuck in my head for a week since I watched the movie. Puss.
You'll never
Boots.
forget about Puss in Boots.
Fear me if you dare.